not nervous tissue. We're going to finish muscle. You are going to have a quiz next time. I am going to make the quiz as challenging as I think you are ready for, in part because I want you to understand how important it is for you to be going to lab, and in part because this is the stuff that takes a while to learn, and if you wait until the last minute, the cramming won't be very effective. So I'm going to give you, remember how little the quiz questions are worth. With the last test, they ended up being worth slightly more than 1/10 of a point apiece. So it's not like I'm ever trying to trash you with the quiz, but sometimes I am trying to motivate you, right, to assess where you are and then motivate you to go a little further. So that's what I'm going to do on Thursday, and if you feel really good and knock it out of the park like a badass, then you can feel really, really good about yourself. If not, you've got some time, right? So you don't have a test anytime soon anyway. Your next test is March 7th or 8th? March 7th. I don't remember which one's a Tuesday and which one's a Wednesday, but the March. Okay, so we are going to finish muscle, and then your quiz will be over this entire set of muscle. And how am I going to ask you the stuff out of the lab and the lecture? This first quiz that's going to be over muscle is going to be over you understanding muscle mechanics within the context of the muscles that you know. So for instance, if I gave you an attachment point, right? If I said I've got a muscle that's attached to the lateral epicondyle of the humerus, right, and crosses whatever joint on the anterior surface, would it be responsible for flexion or extension? Does that make sense? At the wrist, crosses the carpal bones. And then in addition, that corresponds to muscles that you're actually learning. There's actually 4 of them that go the lateral epicondyle, well, 4 that go medial and 4 that go lateral, 4 that go medial epicondyle and 4 that go lateral epicondyle. So this first part is not so much about memorization, but about understanding and then using real muscles that you're actually going to be learning. What we're going to do as we go through the quiz is that I will show you the quiz question, and then after you answer the question that doesn't account for memorization, I will ask you what muscle it's talking about to see if the memorization is getting in there. Right? And then the next quiz that you have, which won't be this week, of course, will be next week or the week after, will see how well you're doing with the memorization portion. Okay? So this one's logic. Attach it, figure out what it does, tell me what the name of it means and where it's telling you, that kind of stuff. Okay? All right. So we are going to start with Roman numeral 5, which is organization of skeletal muscle. And here is where we really diverge from what lab is doing, because the stuff that we're doing today has primarily to do with the functionality of muscle and the physiology of muscle. This is the anatomy that you need to understand the phys that you're going to learn in the future. It also has to do specifically with clinical disorders of muscles like muscular dystrophy and those kinds of things. So what you have to do is you have to take the muscle all the way from the gross anatomy and break it down to the microscopic and submicroscopic anatomy so you can understand how muscle actually contracts. So first thing is that muscle can be thought of as an organ. This can be thought of as an organ because it's not just muscle tissue, it also has connective tissue and blood vessels and nerves associated with it. Does that make sense to you? So this muscle is actually an organ, and it's an organ that is in part composed of skeletal muscle. I think this is trying, does this look like, it looks like to me it's trying to represent the long head of the biceps brachii. I think that's what it looks like. I mean, it doesn't say, but that's kind of what it looks like just because of where the attachment point is going. But I haven't actually looked at it because I think that's the humerus, right? That's the humerus, and I think that's what it's trying to represent. First thing is muscle is not just muscle tissue. It also has a tremendous amount of connective tissue in it. Because what happens is if you imagine a super, super buff dude try to lift up a car, right? It is going to not just shorten, but it's going to put a tremendous amount of tensile pressure on the actual tissue itself, and you don't want it to bust apart. So you guys tell me, with that thought, what kind of tissue would you use to wrap around the outside of a muscle to keep its structural integrity? It is dense irregular, yes. So the tissue that's wrapping around the outside of a muscle is dense irregular connective tissue, and you call it epimysium on the muscle, yeah? Now, let's talk about why you rarely have muscles that tear off of tendons or tendons that tear off of bones. Why does that not happen very frequently? Even with people who are freaking lifting cars, right? what happens is this dense, irregular connective tissue around here is continuous. Like think of the fibers or the fabric as being continuous with the tendon of the muscle. Because the tendon is made of what kind of tissue? Dense regular. So instead of making a seam between the two fabrics, you make the fibers weave in, right? So you've got these fibers running all different directions around the epimysium, and then it weaves into the tendon just by changing the orientation of the fiber. And so what it would look like right at the boundary of that is you couldn't tell whether it was dense regular or dense irregular. But your body doesn't care what the hell you call it. It's just like, this is the thing that works right there. So that's the tendon, right? And then how come the tendon doesn't yank off the bone when you try to freaking pick up a car? Well, because you remember what the superficial surface of the bone, that tissue is made of? Dense irregular, right? So again, you're making a continuous fabric. The fabric here, the fabric there, and then you weave it into the perimysium of the bone. So you have very few times that you ever have a tendon yanked completely off a bone. Now sometimes you can have it yanked partially, but it is a rare, rare occurrence that you have the tendon that completely pops off the bone, especially if you don't have any other physiological abnormalities. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay, so that's not all though. This is stronger than that. So this epimysium is made of dense irregular connective tissue, but then the epimysium will fold in and it will wrap around. It gets thinner as it folds in. It becomes less like dense irregular and more like a hybrid between like a thick areolar versus a thin dense irregular. So it's going to fold in and it's going to wrap around bundles of muscle fibers. When it does that, it's called perimysium. So it's creating little bundles of muscle fibers. The bundles are called fascicles. And you have seen fascicles, even if you have never heard that word before. What a fascicle is a bundle of muscle fibers. And when you're looking at the rectus abdominis, and you can see the fibers, when you've like got it dissected out, you can see the fibers. You're not seeing fibers. Fibers are microscopic. They're micrometers wide. What you're seeing is bundles of fibers. Yeah, you're seeing fascicles. Okay, so it's going to wrap around this fascicle. Yeah, and then, so this is a fascicle. This right here is a fascicle. It's a big bundle of muscle fibers. And then what happens is it folds in again, because we've got another layer. This folds in again and wraps around every single individual muscle fiber, right? So this is all one huge, continuous, thin, thick sheet of connective tissue. One all the way around, and then fold in and wrap around here, and then fold in and wrap around each one of these. Do you see how much structural integrity that actually gives the muscle? Yeah? So it doesn't bust apart very easily. So what do you call each layer? Epi on the outside, peri, endo, mysium. Epi, peri, endo. Okay? You will run into the same thing when we package up a nerve. A nerve has epineurium, perineurium, and endoneurium. It's not an uncommon arrangement. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay, so in addition to this stuff, muscle is incredibly energetically expensive tissue, and it's also very, very highly innervated, and we'll talk about that in more detail in just a second. But generally, what you are going to find, and this is just a general expectation, not every time, per muscle, what you're going to find is at least one artery going to the muscle, usually somewhere around the belly of the muscle it goes in, one vein coming from, and one nerve for innervation. Okay? And then in order to innervate the individual cells, what has to happen is you sort of burrow through the layers of connective tissue to get all the way to the individual cells. So sometimes a big muscle like the gluteus maximus will have more than one artery going to it. But like these muscles will have one artery going to it. So you've usually got one artery, one vein, and one nerve going to the area. So now let's talk about burrowing in a little further. So interesting thing about skeletal muscle. First, skeletal muscle is super energetically expensive. For those of you who have had physiology, and there are a few of you, you know that just the electrical stimulus to cause a contraction is expensive, and then the contraction is incredibly expensive. So it needs a really, really good blood supply to every single muscle fiber. So what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to burrow down and then snuggle each individual muscle fiber. This is a muscle fiber, even though it doesn't look like a cell, it is. We'll talk about why it looks like that in a minute. What you're going to have to do is get capillaries, capillary nets surrounding every single muscle fiber. This is part of the reason that muscle tissue looks red, because it's so very vascular. So for instance, if you were eating a steak, you're eating a cross-section of a cow muscle. super grody when you think about it. It's like, ugh. You're getting a cross-section of the cow muscle. And then when you do that, the tissue, right, is actually red, okay? So because of the capillaries and hemoglobin, and also the cells will be red for a reason I'll explain to you in just a second. Does that make sense? So it's really, really incredibly vascular tissue. In addition, it is also highly innervated. And it's highly innervated because every single skeletal muscle fiber, 1 fiber, 2 fiber, 3 fibers, has to be commanded directly by the nervous system, or else it will never contract. So this is the axon of a neuron, right? And it's actually commanding 3 different muscle fibers. What I'm saying is, if this one gets cut, this fiber is paralyzed. Okay, could be permanent paralysis or temporary, depending on whether the axon has the capacity to regenerate. Does that make sense to you? Okay, now this is not the case with cardiac muscle, right? If you guys, for instance, all on the front row were a row of cardiac muscle cells and I stimulated you, do I have to stimulate each one of you individually? Why not? Yeah, they're holding hands via gap junctions. Exactly, yes, gap junctions. But with skeletal muscle, it is not that way. You have to talk to every single fiber, okay? Which means that if you had nerve damage and you damage just this part in a muscle, you could end up not with muscle paralysis, but with muscle weakness, right? Because some of the fibers have the capacity to contract and others don't, right? Okay, so these have to be told what to do every single time individually. They never remember the commands, and they're never going to do it. They're never going to have any initiative to do it themselves. The metaphor I like to use for this is my 17-year-old. Literally, whenever I ask him to take a shower, first of all, I have to ask him to take a shower every single time. And then second, I have to ask him to wash his hair, because if I didn't say take a shower and wash your hair today, not tomorrow, before 7 p.m., please. He won't do either one of those. And then I just figured out last year that apparently I have to tell him to put on clean underwear every damn time. Because he will put on the dirty underwear. Who does that? I don't even know who does that. I'm like, and you wonder why you don't have any dates. That would be why. So he's a skeletal muscle fiber. Individual, very specific commands every single time. He's getting better, but slowly. What? Oh, I'm not sniffing anything that comes out of his room anymore. His whole room smells like an armpit fart. It's so gross. And he's like in that stage. First of all, he moved his room to the basement. Yeah. And so he's in that stage where like he never opens the windows and never opens the door. Right? He's like in that, like, I am a teenager. I hate everyone. I'm like, fine. Just realize that I am not doing any of your laundry ever again. He's a delightful human. He is just a dirty monkey. He is yes. He is just a dirty little primate in the process of figuring out how to be a clean adult primate.
Yeah, I tell my son, hair button balls.
But I mean, my 15-year-old girl is totally different. She like takes 4 showers a day and takes 200 selfies a day. So, I don't know which one's better. Okay, so skeletal muscle fiber innervation. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go down and try to figure out why these cells don't look like anything you looked at in 1610. We can acknowledge that, right? Like, you're like, I learned all the damn parts of the cell, and then you tell me that's a cell? I don't even know what you're talking about. So this is a skeletal muscle fiber or cell, yeah? And it looks really weird. The reason it looks really weird is because it's got this unique functionality of contraction. And so all of the unique structures in there will be related to the unique function, and we'll get to them in just a second. But FYI, it is a cell, and so it's going to have all of the basic cell stuff. Only, the problem is that some Yahoo, hundreds of years ago, decided that you had to rename everything in a muscle cell. So you learned, for instance, that you call it the cytoplasm. No, we're going to call it sarcoplasm. You learned that it was called the cell membrane. Now we're going to call it the sarcolemma. They renamed everything. They did it to me too. I wouldn't make you learn the names, except that that is how they refer to them in physiology and how they refer to them with clinical disorders. So you have to know them. I don't know who made this decision. Nobody asked my opinion about it. So let's talk about first what is true about skeletal muscles before we get into the details. So from histology, you guys remember that what is true about skeletal muscles before we get into detail is that a single fiber is, of course, striated. We're going to see the basis of the striations today. And a single fiber is multinucleated. Okay. FYI, they become multinucleated during embryonic development because you have these little muscle stem cells called myoblasts. That's not surprising, right? And the myoblasts will fuse during embryonic development, and each one of them keeps a nucleus, right? So they end up being a multinucleated cell. And also for that reason, something important happens. Once you fuse and become multinucleated, it's really going to be hard to do cell division, right? If you're multinucleated. So what we do know is that you pretty much don't get any more cell division of skeletal muscle fibers after embryonic development, which means you were born, with the exception of like a couple of little stem cells, you were born with all of the skeletal muscle fibers you were ever going to have. Okay? You can see that in families, can't you? Have you ever seen families in which like the entire family is just like predisposed to being super buff, right? Like even when like you haven't done anything, like how are you hotter than me when I work out like 5 days a week and you literally have not done anything in recent memory, okay? It's genetics. Now there is certain plasticity to it. We can talk about how you can increase or decrease the mass of your skeletal muscle, but you start out with what you get, right? Okay, so this is what a skeletal muscle fiber looks like in histology, and then let's break it down and look at it a little further. So what we're going to see, let's acknowledge the things that are normal in skeletal muscle fiber, even though they're called abnormal things. This is the cell membrane, which is a phospholipid bilayer. They renamed it just to bother you. They call it the sarcolemma now. The prefix sarco means flesh, and it's usually used to refer to microscopic muscle structures. Okay, sarcolemma. It's just a phospholipid bilayer with like receptors and crab and all transport proteins in it, just like you would expect. Now, what's going to be the relationship between the sarcolemma and the endomysium? Which one's going to be superficial? The endomysium has to be superficial, right? Because the sarcolemma is the literal boundary of the cell. Does that make sense? So it's unusual to have connective tissue on the outside of every single cell. This one is just to add to that like structural stability. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is the sarcolemma. And then inside the sarcolemma, let's look at the things you're going to expect. You're going to have sarcoplasm, which is another word for cytoplasm or intracellular fluid. And there isn't a whole hell of a lot of room for it because that thing's kind of full, but it is in there. Okay. And then what's in the sarcoplasm? Stuff that you expect and stuff that you don't. First off, compared to other cells, skeletal muscle fibers or cells they have a lot of mitochondria. That should make sense, right? Okay. Yeah, they're going to need a lot of ATP usage. So a lot of mitochondria because they are going to need a tremendous amount of ATP compared to other cells. Compared to, for instance, a chondrocyte. Chondrocytes don't do a whole hell of a lot after they make your cartilage. They're just like sitting there fiddling around, like running their sodium potassium pumps, chilling, watching everybody work. So these are mitochondria, okay? And then nuclei, right? Multinucleated. Okay, nuclei do what nuclei do. Genetics, protein synthesis, transcription. Okay, and then we'll address the elephants in the room in just a second, these guys. But let's address some things that are in the sarcoplasm, not visible, but very important. Okay, they're not visible just because they're dissolved proteins in the sarcoplasm, but they will help you understand the functionality of the skeletal muscle fiber. First off, in the sarcoplasm of every single skeletal muscle fiber, you store glycogen. And glycogen is how animals store what? Glucose. So we're starting to see a pattern here, right? We got mitochondria, a bunch of them. We got glucose. And then one other thing is in there, again, but not visible, and that is a protein called myoglobin. And myoglobin is similar to hemoglobin. Hemoglobin binds to and carries what around in the bloodstream? Oxygen. Oxygen, exactly. Now, myoglobin binds to and stores small quantities of oxygen inside each skeletal muscle fiber. So we have every single skeletal muscle fiber has glucose stored, has a little bit of oxygen stored, and has boatloads of mitochondria. And remember that this is your emergency response tissue, right? This is what will get you out of the way of a bus even if you haven't eaten in 16 or 24 hours, right? Because it's always got a piggy bank, right? Not enough to get you away if, for instance, the bus chases you for 25 minutes, right? But to get you some emergency activity. It's always got a little stored. Now, I know some of you guys know that glycogen is primarily stored in the liver, right? And this is in addition to the storage in the liver, because the storage in the liver is not going to get you out of the way of a bus, because it has to be broken down and dumped into the bloodstream. So this is your savings account in the liver. It's not down there. Not uterus. That's not where you store it. Here's the liver. Okay, so the liver, it's your savings account, but sometimes you need access to money faster than your savings account. So this is like a piggy bank in your house, right? You gotta have quick access for every single skeletal muscle fiber. And by the way, skeletal muscle fibers do not share this stuff with each other. It's only for that individual skeletal muscle fiber. Does that make sense? Okay, the other thing is that myoglobin that stores oxygen. So you guys know this. When oxygen binds to hemoglobin, what does it do to the color of your blood? Bright red, right? And when oxygen binds to myoglobin, it makes the individual cells red. Yes? So go back to our super grody example of the cross-section of the cow muscle called the steak, right? And then I want you to imagine that you've got the steak and you sit it on your counter, and when you first sit it on your counter, it's of course red, yes? And then if you let it sit on the counter for 14 hours without doing anything to it, what happens to the color? It becomes brown because the oxygen is dissipating off of the hemoglobin in the capillaries and dissipating off of the myoglobin inside the cells. If you want that to go more quickly, all you have to do is add heat. Does that make sense? So that's sort of the basis of that. That's not all heat does, but it's one of the things that it does. Part of the reason that it makes the tissue brown. Everybody all right with that? Okay, so what else do you have in there? What else you have in there is these, the elephants in the room. What the hell are those things? Those things are called myofibrils. And so myo means muscle, of course. Think of it as like a coaxial cable. And a coaxial cable is like a cable made of cables, right? Or a wire made of wires, right? So what this is you've got a whole bunch of these, each of which we'll break down in just a minute, is made of individual wires, okay? These myofibrils, and I'll explain the details in just a minute, but to give you a start, the myofibrils are attached to the cytoskeleton at the end of each muscle fiber, yeah? And they are contractile. So when you get a myofibril to contract and it pulls on the cytoskeleton, what happens to the length of the muscle cell? It shortens, exactly, yeah? So these are the contractile portion, okay? And we're gonna break down a myofibril in just a second. First, I'm gonna show you how the myofibrils add to the striated nature of the skeletal muscle, and then I'll show you how they individually work. So the myofibrils are composed of this repeating pattern. So before I simplify the pattern, I want you to see. Do you see that you've got light and then dark and then light? And then it's hard to see, but dark. Do you see that? Dark, light. The myofibrils, because they're lined up that way, are the basis of skeletal muscle fiber striations. So what you're actually seeing is you're actually seeing what's inside the skeletal muscle fiber when you look at the histology. They use a protein staining technique, and we'll see that these are actually proteins. So does that make sense to you guys? Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to take one of these and start to look at the repeating pattern. So we'll find a pattern until it repeats. And it basically will repeat from this jagged line to this hard-to-see jagged line. Do you see that one? Okay, and what we're going to do is I'll draw a bad picture on the board, and there'll be a good picture projected. Sometimes it's helpful just to draw, even if you're drawing a bad one. Okay, so do you see how this here to here is related to this here to here? Right? So they're just flattening it out and making it 2D so you can actually see the sort of repetition of the patterns. What you have is this big thing is made of a couple of long, skinny proteins, right? Two of them are going to be the primary ones that you're going to be concerned about. And these long, skinny proteins are going to be the basis of contraction. So let's just build it. We'll build it simply. And then we'll start wiggling it once you guys understand the pattern. Okay, so I want you to think of the myofibril going all along the length of the cell and attaching to the cytoskeleton like a train, and then like the individual pattern that repeats is like boxcars on the train. Does that make sense? So from one jagged line to the next, that's where the pattern starts to repeat. Yeah? This entire structure is called a sarcomere, and it goes from here to here. Yeah? Okay. So the sarcomere is primarily, now this is an oversimplification, by the way, because the list gets really deep. So I'm going to leave out a few of the structures that are involved here. You'll learn them later. What I want you to have is enough anatomical understanding that you have a place to put the fizz when you learn it later. So, so first thing is that there are two primary skinny proteins that are going to be involved. These are proteins that, for instance, would have been made in the rough ER or the ribosomes of the muscle cell itself. Okay, so one of them I have long skinny protein that attaches to the Z lines, the jagged lines, and extends toward the middle, but doesn't get all the way there. Let's define the boundaries of this before we go any further. These are called Z lines, or this anatomy book calls them Z discs. I'm just not in the habit of saying that. It doesn't really matter. The phys book calls them Z lines. Almost everything else I've seen calls them Z lines. And then this protein, do you see that if you're looking at the red one versus the yellow one, this one's thinner? Okay, so the red one is the thinner protein. It's called actin, that's just the name of the protein, and sometimes it's referred to as the thin myofilament. Thin for obvious reasons. Myo means muscle and filament means long skinny thing, right? And what it is, of course, is protein. Yeah? So it's the actin thin myofilament. And then sort of floating in the middle and not attached to the Z lines is a much thicker protein. You see that one? Thicker one? This one is called myosin, the name of the protein, and it is the thick myofilament. Okay, so now I want to describe to you how that will end up with striped tissue. Okay, and then I'll wiggle it. So how does this end up with the striped tissue? If I use protein staining, yes, then wherever I have thicker or denser or more protein, it's going to be darker. Yeah? So what I'm going to end up having right here is the myosin is a much thicker or denser protein. So this line down here will be darker than the one next to it. Does that make sense? This is called the A band or the dark band. And then I'm going to have light until I hit the next myosin. Does that make sense to you? Which will go into the beginning of the next one. This will be called the I band or the light band. So showing you here, this is the A band, yeah? And then the I band goes to the beginning of the next A band. Go ahead.
So A band is in between those two blue lines and I band is?
Yes, I band is till the beginning of the next A band, right? Okay, so what we see in an individual muscle fiber, skeletal muscle fiber, is that the A bands all line up with one another. And the I bands all line up with one another. Yeah? And then you end up having the entire tissue that's striped in a pretty dependable way. So let's go back to this for just a second. So what does A and I stand for? You don't really care, but I'll tell you a way to remember. It stands for anisotropic and isotropic, but nobody ever asks you that. How do you remember which one's which? A is the second letter of dark, D-A-R-K, and I is the second letter of light, L-I-G-H-T. Okay, so I'm going to give you one last little player in here, and that is that this area, do you see this area right here in the middle? That's got myosin, but actin isn't overlapping it. That's going to be slightly lighter than the rest of the dark band right here. This is going to be called the H zone. And it is right here. Okay, so now, does that make sense? Yeah, right here, H zone.
So it's just a space.
It's, so since you use protein staining, this part will be darker because it's got more protein.
Okay.
Yeah, and then that part will be slightly lighter.
Will be
not
sliding
sliced
the whole
here.
way up.
Yeah, all the way up, yeah. And if you get skeletal muscle histology slide close enough, you can see the H zone. But if you don't get it close enough, you can't always see it. Okay, so now I'm going to add a little bit more detail because I can tell you why you have to learn it all the way to this level of detail. The reason you have to learn it all the way to this level of detail is because this is how you can start talking about contraction. If I just add a little bit more, you can start talking about contraction. First off, you can see on the picture that the myosin has little projections sticking up from it. You see that? These are called Myosin Heads. And I want you to think of them like hands for a second. And then, although you can't see it on here because it's actually not like a physical loop, it's actually a binding site, I'm going to draw it here and make it look like a handle so you can see sort of the metaphor that we're going for. What these actually are is binding sites for the myosin heads. So these are called actin active sites. Okay, so now I can give you a preview of the complexity of muscle contraction. Because what I want to tell you is upon nervous system stimulation, when the nervous system tells it to and not if it doesn't, what is going to happen is the hands are going to reach up and grab the handles and pull. And when they do, what's going to happen to the distance between the Z lines? It's going to shrink. Exactly. Does that make sense? Okay, so it's going to shrink. But this actually doesn't change the length of the actin or the myosin. What it does is it slides the filaments past one another. Do you see? Yeah? So what I want you to imagine is that like on the monkey bars, right? When you go down the monkey bars and you're the straight ones, you're doing it like this. Only I want you to imagine that you're like a badass beast of a child, and instead of moving you to the end of the monkey bars, you pull the monkey bars to you, right? And then on the other side, you do the same thing, right? You're just pulling it into you. So which one really doesn't change upon contraction, the A band or the I band? A band, because you pull everything into the A band, right? It's just sitting there being a little beast child and pulling everything into it. So if you want to see the difference, this is relaxed sarcomere. So starting at the top, here's the A band, H zone, I band, relaxed, right? Here is partially contracted. Notice that the I band got smaller. The H zone is almost completely gone. And then here is maximally contracted. The whole darn thing is pretty much A band. That's actually how they discovered what skeletal muscle was doing. So fascinatingly, long before we had protein staining techniques, even when I took physiology, we used to do a lot of animal experimentation in the phys lab. This was before all of the correctness. So one of the things that we did to understand this was that we took a frog gastrocnemius muscle and we stuck it under the microscope while the muscle was still alive, and then we stimulated it with electricity, and what you would see is the tissue would go from being striped to being almost completely dark, to being striped, to being almost completely dark, to being striped, to being almost completely dark. So you could stimulate it and watch what actually happened there. So they saw that long before they had protein staining, and then once they had protein staining, they figured out, oh my gosh, what's happening is the fibers, the filaments are just sliding past one another. So this is called the sliding filament theory, or the sliding filament mechanism of muscle contraction. Does that make sense to you? So when you're completely contracted, the H zone is pretty much gone, right? And the A band is pretty much gone, okay? Now, when you take phys, you will learn a lot more detail about that. This is just the anatomy that helps you understand it. If you take phys first and do it the hard way, then you have to learn all of the anatomy by yourself to understand the physiology. Okay, so we have the Z lines, the A band, the I band, and the H zone. And so the basis of skeletal muscle contraction is that sarcomere anatomy. And this is why you have to get all the way down to the submicroscopic level before you can start talking about muscle physiology. To get all the way down there. And then when you take phys, you'll learn how energy is used, what happens if you don't have it, right? What happens, how quickly you actually burn it up, how quickly the contractions occur. Okay, so that's all the complexity we are going to go into. But now what I want to do is to try to put that back together with the big picture of muscle, yeah? So what I want to do is I want to practice the terminology so that you can figure out gross anatomy all the way down to submicroscopic and then go back up. So we're going to start at gross anatomy, and I'm going to tell you that an entire muscle, a whole muscle, is wrapped in connective tissue. And the connective tissue that wraps the whole muscle is called what? Epi on the outside. Epimysium, yes? Okay, and then the whole muscle can be broken into bundles of muscle fibers. An individual bundle of muscle fibers is called a what? Fascicle. And every fascicle is wrapped in a layer of connective tissue called what? Perimysium, right? And a fascicle is composed of multiple muscle cells, also called muscle fibers. Yes, they're called muscle fibers. And each muscle fiber is wrapped in connective tissue called endomysium. Deep to the endomysium, you run into the cell membrane of the muscle fiber called what? Sarcolemma. Sarcolemma, okay? Within the sarcolemma, you have these big bundles of contractile proteins. Yes? These big bundles of contractile proteins are called what? The bundle? Myofibril. And the myofibril is composed of two primary contractile filaments, a thick one called myosin and a thin one called actin. Yes? And the repeating arrangement of actin and myosin that gives the striations, that repeating arrangement is called a what? That repeating arrangement, it's called sarcomere. Yeah? Okay, that makes sense to you? Okay, so now we're going to go back up, and you guys are going to be even more helpful this time, right? This time we're going to start from microscopic or submicroscopic and move up. Okay, there are two primary contractile proteins in muscle. A thin one called actin and a thick one called myosin. The repeating arrangement of actin and myosin that gives skeletal muscle its striations is called a what? Sarcomere. Yes. Line up sarcomere after sarcomere after sarcomere to make a big long cable of contractile proteins. And that big long cable or bundle of contractile proteins is called a what? Myofibril. The myofibril attaches to the cytoskeleton of the skeletal muscle cell or skeletal muscle fiber, right? It's attached, the skeletal muscle cell, also called a skeletal muscle fiber. Yes? Okay. The skeletal muscle fiber's boundary is the cell membrane or the what? Sarcolemma, exactly. Superficial to the sarcolemma, you run into the first layer of connective tissue that surrounds each skeletal muscle fiber, and that's called endomysium. Bundle up a whole bunch of skeletal muscle fibers into a bundle of fibers called a what? Fascicle. And the fascicle is wrapped in connective tissue called perimysium, exactly. And then bundle all of the fascicles together to make a whole muscle and wrap it in connective tissue called epimysium. So do you see the sort of big to small? If you can do it that way, especially if you can write it at the same time, then there's hardly any trick questions to put all the structures together. So the last thing I want to talk about before we move into cardiac muscle is, so I told you guys before that you don't really get any new skeletal muscle fibers to speak of after embryonic development, but we know that your muscles can get bigger, yeah? So how can I make this muscle bigger or stronger? Well, these are contractile proteins, right? And if I have more of those, then I will be able to generate more tensile strength, right? So what you can do, even though you don't get to make any appreciable number of new cells, is that you can pack the cells that you own with more myofibrils, more actin and more myosin, yes? And so, of course, you know how that occurs because you're a person, right? And you've been doing things for a little while. If, for instance, you have a combination of communicating to your muscles that they are not quite strong enough by trying to pick up something 8 times that is at almost the limit of your capacity, yes? Like high weight, low rep. If you have that in combination of making sure you're feeding yourself plenty of protein and nutrients so that you can do protein synthesis, then what will happen is after you do that kind of stimulation, you can actually end up making more myofibrils inside your muscle. And you end up building both more muscle mass, and also more strength in your muscles, right? But you can't do that thing that a lot of times women do. Women are like, okay, well, I want to both severely restrict my calories and increase muscle mass simultaneously. You can't do that. You actually have to feed yourself protein in adequate amounts of calories because those are all anabolic processes, right? You have to actually have nutrients and energy, and you have to have the amino acids to actually make your muscles in order to do that. But one last little tidbit about this and just being a person and having a body, and that is that this tissue is incredibly energetically expensive. I already told you that. So if you have more of this tissue mass, and by the way, this tissue isn't just energetically expensive when you're wiggling it, it's never completely relaxed. So it's always using sort of a baseline level of energy. And if you have more of it, then you are going to have a higher basal metabolic rate. Does that make sense? So if you have two people that are about the same body size, but one of them has a lot more muscle mass, they can just sit around looking hot, burning a cheeseburger, right? Just sit around, right? This is one of the reasons that males tend to have a higher metabolic rate than females because testosterone increases muscle mass, increases basically protein synthesis in your skeletal muscles, and they tend to have more muscle mass and therefore a higher basal metabolic rate than females. Not that you can't get up there, but it's going to require a little bit more work for a female to get up to that level. That makes sense to you guys? Okay, so that's skeletal muscle, and now all we have to do is just sort of compare it to cardiac muscle and smooth muscle. We'll do cardiac muscle in a little bit more detail when we do the cardiovascular system, but it probably won't surprise you that cardiac muscle has the same basic internal anatomy of the contractile proteins. You can kind of start to see them in here, right? You got an A band, and an I band, and an A band. So it's got actin and myosin, and they're arranged in sarcomeres. It's got some similarities and some differences. Of course, you only find this in the wall of the heart, and it is involuntarily stimulated instead of voluntarily stimulated. Each cell is uninucleated instead of multinucleated. And then, of course, one of the big ones is that the cells talk to each other via the gap junctions at intercalated discs. And remember that these look like really dark striations, but what they are, remember, if you want to see the striations, you use protein staining techniques. This is gap junctions and desmosomes, which are both proteins. So it just seems really dark right there, okay? And then the other thing about cardiac muscle is that cardiac muscle can branch. So if I got a stimulus, I don't just have to talk to you, I can talk to you as well. Does that make sense? So this is sort of the basis of cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle does not store as much glycogen as skeletal muscle, and it stores almost zero oxygen. So if you do not supply it adequately with blood, it will die. So that's the basics of cardiac muscle. And then with smooth muscle, you would think that since smooth muscle doesn't look striated, it has an entirely different structural framework in the inside, but it doesn't. It's just that it doesn't line up. So, okay, look at this one more time and notice just sort of the basics. Actually, let's look at this one. The basic look of the sarcomere. You've got your yellow myosin and your sort of reddish actin. And then look at how smooth muscle is arranged. So you still have this thing that looks kind of like a sarcomere, right? It's not exactly, because it doesn't end in Z lines. Still got actin and still got myosin. But you don't get any stripes because they're at all different angles. Yeah? And so when you stimulate it, which is involuntary, smooth muscle, what happens is instead of just pulling like these two dimensions, it squishes into the middle. So this is a relaxed smooth muscle cell, and this is a contracted smooth muscle cell. But it still has actin and myosin and similarities in the contractile mechanism, but it doesn't have the same pattern, and so that's why it's called smooth. So with smooth muscle, the cells are uninucleated and they're involuntary. You, of course, find smooth muscle in the walls of hollow organs and tubes, except for the heart, right? And so let's talk about how smooth muscle can actually move things through tubes. You've probably heard the word peristalsis before. Have you heard that word before? If not, let's talk about it. Okay, so I want you to imagine I took a cross-section of a tube that has smooth muscle in the wall, like the small intestine. And so here's the lumen of the small intestine. And then, so the way that this actually works to get things to move through, so imagine this is my small intestine. I'm going to have two layers of smooth muscle that are going to alternate contracting to move things. So smooth muscle, I've got one layer that is closest to the lumen, and it's going to be called the circular layer because the cells are arranged that way. Yeah? And so when that one contracts, what will happen to the diameter of the tube? It will shrink, yeah? And then I've got another one that is the fibers are arranged longitudinally. And so when I contract that one, what will happen to the length of the tube? It's going to shrink. So what you're going to do is if I start the stimulus from the proximal end, because I want stuff to move that direction, what's going to happen is you will squish, 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 and then pull, 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 pull. Yeah? Does that make sense? Squish, 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 pull, pull, pull. And that's called peristalsis. So you're alternating contraction of the circular layer and the longitudinal layer. And remember, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but smooth muscle usually has gap junctions as well. So if you start from the proximal end, you'll move it through. If you want a really good example of this, have you ever seen a snake eat? So a snake eats something whole, right? And when it enters the intestine, their intestine just happens to be long and skinny because their body is, and you can sort of see it going through. So what happens, I used to own a whole bunch of snakes. So what happens is you can sort of see the compression of the loaf internally, and then you can see it move back. And then you see the compression and it moves back. And of course it's decreasing in size because you're pulling the nutrients and the mass out of it, right? And so it just continues to like squish, pull, squish, pull, squish, pull, till it comes out that end as a disgusting loaf of mouse parts. Snake poop is stinky. Does that make sense to you guys? So this is peristalsis and that's smooth muscle. Okay, so that's the end of the material for your quiz, but we're going to briefly start on the nervous system. And we are going to be ahead of lab for a couple of weeks because, of course, you guys are going to be preparing for a lab practical after this week, right? This week is axial muscles, yeah? Okay, all right, so you'll have to tell me whether you agree once you get through it, but in my perspective, I think that muscle is the hardest part of lab, and the nervous system is the hardest part of lecture. Go ahead.
There's a case article about a lady who went tanning too much and ended up with a problem called, I think it was actinic keratosis.
Actinic keratosis? Okay,
So
what
I'm assuming
happened?
they're talking about the protein. Oh, she just like splotchy.
So it's got to be a skin issue.
So you think like her protein's keratized?
Yeah, so, well, we're going to do skin. Actually, we're supposed to do skin right now, aren't we?
It's the next one on the list anyways.
I'm going to do muscle one. I'm going to do nervous system one first, and then I'll do skin. And maybe I won't do skin. I don't know. Sometimes I don't do skin because it's like you don't need very much help with skin, right? And you need a lot of help with other stuff. So I'll leave that for later. I was supposed to do skin next, but anyway, I'll start. Send me an email about that, and I'll see if I can include it in skin, but I don't know it yet. But if it seems relevant and interesting, I'll learn it well enough to make
She was
it.
Irish, so.
She was Irish?
Yeah.
No. Irish people are not supposed to be tan.
You know.
No. That's not how that's supposed to work. You know where you evolved, right? You're like right up there, and they're like, isn't any sun. So I'm surprised she just didn't have cancer.
Yeah.
Multiple forms of cancer. I will do skin. I'll do skin after nervous system. Okay. I want to start talking about nervous system briefly, and then I'll figure out where I'm going to put skin. So I want to talk about why nervous system is difficult and sort of expectations of what to know about it. The first reason is I think muscle is most difficult in lab. I think nervous system is most difficult in lecture. And in part, I think this is just, you can tell me if I'm wrong because I don't actually know. I think nervous system is most difficult because of three things. First, if you have ever had anatomy before, you have probably had skeletal anatomy and muscular anatomy. So you had some exposure to muscular and skeletal anatomy. But people generally don't teach very much of the nervous system in anatomy courses before the college level, in part because it's really freaking hard to teach. It's really hard to make it actually make sense. And in addition, number two is the terminology is all unfamiliar. You haven't used these terms. They're not used in common life. It's all really unfamiliar terminology. And then the third thing, I think, is that the nervous system is more confusing to humans than any other system, because this is the thing that we use to understand this thing. And so we don't know what to leave out. So there are literally 6 nervous system chapters just in your anatomy book. And that's not even talking about the phys, right? So you don't have to know 6 chapters. You have to know what's in your notes, because I've tried to pull the stuff that seems relevant either to the anatomy or to the physiology that I think you're going to need in the future. So use your notes as a guide. I will try to make it really logical. You will have to tackle the terminology. It will take some wrestling with the terminology of the nervous system, but you've got a long time before you have a test, so you don't really have to worry about it too much. So let's go to the basic understanding of the nervous system. The nervous system is my favorite, by the way. It's my absolute obsessive favorite. It's not usually students' favorites until they've been out of my class for like 2 years, and then they email me and they'll say, I love the nervous system. I just didn't want you to test me over it. I just wanted to talk about it. I just want to like sit around and talk about it. Let's talk about basic functionality of the nervous system before we even get into anything detailed. The basic functionality of the nervous system is, to sort of oversimplify it, it does 3 things. So I want you to imagine sticking your hand on a hot stove and then remedying that situation. It requires 3 steps. The nervous system is one of your body systems that is responsible for control and communication. It's responsible for getting signals from point A to point B and responding to signals. The other one is the endocrine system, which we don't cover in anatomy because it's not really an anatomical system. So, nervous system, what does it do for you? I'm going to stick my hand on a hot stove and I have to remedy the situation, and there are 3 steps. The first step is information in, yeah? And that's called sensation, yeah? But that doesn't solve the problem, right? Just sensing that there is a problem is not actually solving the problem. So the next step is integration. And integration is really what happens either in the brain or the spinal cord, but let's just say it's the brain for this one. You go in, and there is a place in your brain that knows how hot is too hot and what to do about it. So you send the information in, and then the brain generally subconsciously says, I'm going to compare actual to ideal, right? Actual temperature to ideal body temperature. If there is a big error message between the 2 of them, I will say, that's too damn hot. Right? And then I will make a decision about what needs to occur. I haven't done anything yet, right? So that's just sort of the assessment and decision-making portion that is generally in the brain or the spinal cord, okay? And then the next is solve the problem. So you have to send the information back out to something that can remedy the problem, right? And that will be response. So sensation in, integration within, response out. Does that make sense? And the nervous system does all 3 of them. Now this is an incredibly simple example, right? Just hand on a hot stove. But there are really complex examples, and the complex examples make it really difficult to figure out what's going to go on. So we deal with the simple ones. But then let's just acknowledge that when you are, for instance, in October, when you were watching the presidential debates, the sensation was coming in, yes? Right? And your integration was like, oh, Jesus, we're all going to die. One way or the other, or I hate everything about him or her, or all of them, literally all of them. So that's integration, and you're like figuring out what the hell to do. And your response, your integration is entirely based on that like complexity, on your experience, right? And then your response is not as simple as hand moving off of a hot stove, right? You could, for instance, make yourself another cocktail, right? You could do that. You could throw something at the wall. You could call your congressman, right? Whatever you do. And I did all of them, and none of it worked, right? So the sensation, integration, and response, when we use a simple example, it makes the nervous system really easy to understand. But then, of course, the most interesting part of the nervous system is not something that's that simplistic. It's something that's like intelligence and decision-making processes. So what we'll do is we'll start out simple. We'll get a little more complicated, but we won't ever get as complicated as the nervous system actually is, because there is literally no way that you can do that in the 2 weeks that we spend on the nervous system. So sensation, integration, and response. Okay, so let's just start with the basic organization of the nervous system, just the basics. to start getting you to understand what this has to do with the histology that you've already learned and what it has to do with the brain that you have known that you have. So first thing is, we're just going to do easy stuff today, nothing hard. We are going to just acknowledge that the nervous system can be roughly divided into the CNS and the PNS. Yes? Central nervous system is only brain and spinal cord. PNS is any nervous tissue that is not brain or spinal cord. So the brain and spinal cord is kind of pinkish there, and the other is yellow. Okay. So the central nervous system is really where most of the complexity goes on. The rest of it is mostly wiring because it's sensation, right? The integration, most of it goes on in the central nervous system, and the response is just going back out through the wiring. So really the vast majority of the complexity actually occurs in the central nervous system. But things that you already know, as far as the CNS goes, the brain is located in what cavity? Cranial, and the spinal cord is located in the vertebral or spinal. And so what is in there? What kind of tissue is in there? You know it's nervous tissue. It doesn't all look like you expected it to. So I want to show you just the basics of if I took a chunk of brain matter. First I'm going to do a section and then tell you sort of what to expect. First question is, this is a section of the brain. What kind of section is it? That's a coronal section of the brain. Okay, and you will see, and you have heard before, that the brain has two really different kinds of tissues. One of them is actually called gray matter, and you can see that it's darker, yeah. And the other is called white matter, and you can see that it's lighter. So here's a great metaphor for starting to think about the gray matter and the white matter. The gray matter tends to be actual neurons, the cells that have the processing and decision-making power. I am not saying you're conscious of the decisions. I am saying that they are going to be the processing power, okay? And since the processing power goes on in different places in the brain, in order to have whole brain functionality, you're going to have to communicate between them, right? For instance, speech primarily happens in the left cerebral hemisphere. But in order to coordinate my actions, my body with my speech, I have to get both sides going, right? Because I talk with my hands. Or for instance, what if you were actually doing sign language? And you would actually have to get speech to go to both sides. So I've got processing power here and processing power here. What is the white matter? If the gray matter is processing power, the white matter is the wiring between them. Yes? So, and we will look at the wiring. It's actually mostly axons that have myelin on them. So the central nervous system is really important for a bunch of reasons, and you have to keep it protected because with almost zero exceptions, the central nervous system tissue of gray matter and white matter is amitotic. It does not repair if you damage it in the brain and the spinal cord, okay? So it does have what's called neuroplasticity, which means, for instance, if I had a brain injury or a stroke and I lost the gray matter that was responsible for speech in my left cerebral hemisphere, my left temporal lobe, what happens is my brain has so much plasticity that you can pass off that functionality to another area of gray matter. So you don't get this one back. But it's like everybody was cross-trained, right? The entire gray matter was cross-trained. So it says, I am a processor. I don't care what I process. Just give me something to process, and then I will process it. Does that make sense? Okay, so you got the gray matter and the white matter. So if I take a chunk right here, this is actually supposed to represent gray matter. I don't know why they did it there, but if you take a chunk of mostly gray matter, I want you to see what's actually in there. Okay, what's actually in the gray matter is, of course, cells that you know. What are these? Yeah, those are neurons. Okay, and the neurons, of course, are your decision makers. Those are going to be releasing neurotransmitters and doing the stuff that you're interested in. And then the other ones are these guys right here. Those are all glial cells. You didn't learn multiple kinds of glial cells, and you didn't identify them from a histology slide. But there are 6 different kinds of glial cells, and they all have sort of specialized cell function. So if you look at a chunk, what you're going to see is a bunch of neurons, its support staff, which is the glial cell, and then you're almost invariably going to see blood vessels running through because it is incredibly energetically expensive tissue. That make sense? Okay, so last couple things. Every single sensation that you have has to go to the central nervous system for integration. But it's probably humbling for you to know that you are not aware of the vast majority of sensations that are going on. You are only aware of a very small quantity. For instance, you are monitoring your own blood pressure right now. You have no conscious awareness of it. You are monitoring your own blood pH right now. You are monitoring your own glucose concentration right now. All of that is being sent for integration, but you are not consciously aware of it. And all motor commands, all response commands come from the central nervous system, but you are actually only in control of a single tissue in your entire body, which is a very humbling thing to think about. So you've got all of these tissues, and there is only one that you can voluntarily control. And what is it? That's all you can control. You can't even control your own brain activity. Have you ever tried to stop having that song stuck in your head? No, it ain't going, right? Stop thinking about that dumb thing that you said that one time. Just stop it right now, right? Stop thinking about that. You can't control that either. All you can control is skeletal muscle. You can't control glandular secretion. You can't control how quickly your heart beats, with a couple of exceptions. You can do some feedback mechanisms that will eventually control what's happening up here. You can't control an inappropriate time to have diarrhea, right? Can't control any of that. So you're really only in control of a single tissue in your entire body. And in order to control that tissue, it is only the most superficial 4 millimeters of your brain at all, called the superficial cerebral cortex, that has any conscious awareness or voluntary activity at all. All of it. We will start there next time after your quiz, which will be just about muscles. And then I'll tell you guys when I decide to do skin. I forgot that I was supposed to do it
What was
next.
the green matter made of mostly again?
Neurons and glial cells,
And glues.
and the white matter is mostly made of axons.
Axons. Okay.